Good morning,
Morning.
and welcome to today's Criminal Justice Summit titled Justice 2020, The Demand for Equity. My name is ESTHER PAYNE, and I am the Executive Director of Cabrini Green Legal Aid. In this unprecedented time, few populations have been hit harder by the pandemic and by systemic racial injustices than people of color and communities that come in contact with the criminal justice system, specifically Black and Brown communities. It is with this in mind that Cabrini Green Legal Aid and the Illinois Justice Project welcome you to today's event. We are so excited to have you. We have almost 500 participants registered and tons more viewing us live on YouTube. We recognize that in our present moment, the inequities that our communities are experiencing are not new, but rather being highlighted as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic and the murders of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, Rayshard Brooks, and so many others whose names need to be spoken. There have been protests and civil uprisings from communities demanding equity, accountability, and declaring that change is necessary and must happen now. With the help of experts from the field, including advocates, policymakers, elected officials, and individuals with lived experiences, this event will identify the most pressing issues facing those affected by the justice system and suggest solutions that we must all take responsibility for in order to effectuate the positive change we are seeking. Our panelists will consider how the adaptations within the system as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic and subsequent widespread calls to eliminate racism in the system have affected individual experiences and the overall equity of the justice system. The goals for today will allow us to review the current changes that have been made to address COVID-19, invite experts to assess which of those changes can be expanded or improved upon as we emerge from this pandemic. This includes exploring what resources and services are needed to create safe communities while ensuring equity, and examine what changes are necessary to establish safety and equity within policing, incarceration, and post-release practices in response to the calls for justice following the continual abuse and murders of Black people at the hands of police. The event will take place in 3 panels, each aimed to address a different section of the justice system with a variety of experts in the field, centering our attention on policing practices, the effects of incarceration and the role of decarceration, as well as what is needed to create effective reentry from those released from jails and prisons. Following my introduction, the program will be self-executing, allowing time for breaks in between and a brief wrap-up at the end to summarize what we've heard today. We have an amazing lineup and great responders who will take a deep dive into the issues, give their responses to the panelists, and foster discussion that is sure to advance our thinking and our action towards transformation and equitable solutions. Bios can be found on our registration website, and the panels will occur in the following order. The policing panel will immediately follow my remarks, ending at 10:15. The courts and incarceration panel will take place from 11:15 to 12:45, and the post-release and reentry panel will close out the day from 1:30 to 2:45 p.m. I'd like to thank our partners at the Illinois Justice Project and our co-conveners, the Alumni Association, Black Roots Alliance, Chicago Appleseed Fund for Justice, Children and Family Justice Center, and Community Renewal Society. Lastly, I would like to offer special thanks and appreciation to each of the panelists who have agreed to share their perspectives with us today, and to Angelique Power, Craig Delamore, and Michelle Morales for leading these critical conversations. Again, thank you for joining us. Please enjoy the program as it is sure to make you think and hopefully incite both individual and collective impact. And with that, I am going to turn it over to Angelique Power, President of the Field Foundation of Illinois, to get us started. Thank you all.
Thank you, Esther. It is impossible to not live in retrospect right now, as if we are watching the ink dry on a history book written in real time, knowing that 2020 is a year that will be studied. As Esther mentioned in her opening, just 8.5 weeks ago, the world watched the modern-day lynching of a Black man named George Floyd by a white police officer, committed in plain sight. Perhaps because so many of us are in this time warp of quarantine during the pandemic, perhaps because it came on what feels like a time loop of repeated killings of Black people at the hands of police. This time, this video seemed to cause something across the world to break free. We are now witnessing the largest uprisings in our history, protests happening across the world that call George Floyd's name, that center anti-racism, anti-Blackness, and what we will focus on in this morning's conversation, that call out police misconduct, that demand money move from police budgets, defund, to community wellness budgets, invest. We've heard calls to abolish police and prisons and instead invest wholly in community restorative justice frameworks. And across the nation, these calls that have been dismissed in the past as radical and unrealistic are suddenly being heeded. LA, San Francisco, Boston, all moving money from police budgets to community services or directing police to no longer answer non-criminal calls. So what will the history books say about Chicago? Arguably the greatest city on the planet, the birthplace of bare-knuckled grit and house music and buildings that attempt to scrape the sky. We now have our first Black female mayor, known on social media as Auntie Lori, social media that lit up last night as the Columbus statue was removed. Our mayor came into the office having served on the police board, which is still a sore point with some of the city's most visionary organizers, and having authored a prescient police task force report that boldly called out years of entrenched systemic racism at a time when it was unheard of to do so. So if we agree change is needed, then how can we best understand the difference between those suggesting reforms, those calling for defunding police, and those who posit an abolitionist framework is the only way to best protect our communities from harm? What are the differences here? And how do we move forward to a city of abundance for everyone? Let's dive in first with brief comments from our elected officials on the panel about the moment that we are in. And next, I'll go deeper with each of the panelists to allow for dialogue and exchange. We will begin with the Honorable Senator Durbin, who has a tight timeline this morning and won't be able to join us for too long. Senator Durbin, thank you for getting us started.
Thank you very much for the introduction. Last night, I watched a baseball game. I've been waiting for a long time, and others have as well. Yankees versus the Nationals. Before the game started, it was interesting. There was a moment when the players on both teams went on the field and took a knee, just like Colin Kaepernick did about 4 or 5 years ago. But now it's acceptable. When he did it, it was considered to be edgy, extreme, revolutionary. What happened in the meantime? Well, 8 minutes and 46 seconds on the streets of Minneapolis happened, and many other events just like that. America has awakened to racism and law enforcement, and so has the world. I watched an Italian soccer match. I'm sports starved, as you can tell, and watched as the Italian players, before the match began, took a knee on the pitch, as we are doing now in our baseball stadiums. So the question, obviously, is this the moment in history? As Angelique noted, are we watching something here that is truly unique and will change America? I want it to be true. but I'm also a realist. We've been facing slavery and racism in the United States since before we were the United States, for over 400 years. And we've seen this kind of discrimination, not just against African Americans, but against Native Americans, against Hispanics, against Muslims. The list goes on and on. So is this a moment of revolution? It could be. It absolutely could be. And the reason I say that is I believe that the forces at work on the streets now for Black Lives Matter and to dramatize this issue are different than before. I go to these rallies and protests, and I will tell you, I look around and recognize a few people, but I don't know most of the people who are there. They're Black, white, and brown. They're young, they're old, men and women. We have high school students in downstate Illinois who are putting together Black Lives Matter rallies in towns and counties with no African American population. But they're doing it because they're determined that something's going to change in their generation. They don't want to grow up in the shadow of racism. They don't want to raise their families in the shadow of racism. And the question is, what are we going to do about it? So I'm glad to be on the program with Kwame Raoul. As a state senator and attorney general, he's been a real leader in this area. Kwame, thanks for all you've done. I also wanted to say that Mayor Lightfoot has been outspoken on this issue for a long, long time. Governor Pritzker the same. So there's some real determination at the highest levels to get something done. Now in Washington, we've got a problem. And the problem is the President of the United States. Is there anyone who believes he will truly sign a bill that is meaningful when it comes to reform in this area? I'm a doubter. I don't think he will. We see the campaign he's running, the campaign of fear and hate, saying that forget about COVID-19, worry about who's menacing us in our streets and tearing down our statues and the rest of those things. I don't think he's the man of the moment to do it. And so far, that's what stopped us in the Republican Senate. Nancy Pelosi and the House Democrats have passed the Justice and Policing Act. I commend them for that. It was an extraordinary effort, bipartisan effort on their part. We put the same measure together in the United States Senate. Our leaders are Cory Booker, Kamala Harris, and I'm happy to be the third on the list supporting this legislation. It's lengthy. It includes 20 or so different provisions, but it's meaningful. It isn't just a token response to George Floyd's tragic death and the deaths of others. And it's been endorsed by every major civil rights and human rights organization. The Republican measure, written largely by one interest group, has not. And so far, it has stumbled in the Senate as it should. What we're asking for is the real bill, Justice and Policing, to move forward. And there are provisions in there that are just not included in the Republican bill. Let me mention a few. The bill does not prohibit racial profiling, a measure which I introduced years ago, which I think is just fundamental to law enforcement. The bill does not reform qualified immunity. How are the victims and the families of victims supposed to recover in civil litigation without changing qualified immunity? It does not ensure that officers are trained on racial and implicit bias. Fails to limit the transfer of military equipment to police. The list goes on. We need to do the right thing. We need to say to the people in the streets and families across America who are now of one voice when it comes to this issue, we're going to make a real change here that makes a real difference. After 400 years of struggling with slavery and racism, it is time for us, in the memory of George Floyd and others, to step forward. Let me close by saying I wish I could stay for the remainder of your program, but I can't. But I want to say a word about CABRINI Green Legal Aid, one of the best, not just in Chicago and Illinois, but across the nation. I've met with you many times. I know what you do as part of your work. It is just invaluable. And for so many attorneys that I've spoken to who say, well, what can I do? I'm just a voter. No, you're more than that. You're a licensed professional, and we need your help in both criminal and civil litigation. We need you to step up. So those of you who are not active members of CABRINI Green Legal Aid, give them a call. They got some work for you to do. And we need you now more than ever. So Senator Duckworth and I are co-sponsoring this bill. We're going to keep pushing to get it done before the end of the year. We don't believe that this bill will ever be signed by this president based on the things that he has said, but this is a cause that is not going to die out. We're going to get something done.
Thank you, Senator. Thanks for your remarks and also for the shout out to CGLA. We'd like to turn to the Honorable Mayor Lightfoot next.
Good morning, everyone, and good morning to you, Angelique. I want to pick up on a point that you made, and it's whether or not we will seize this moment as an opportunity. I've been thinking a lot these days about my father. My father has been dead now 10 years, but I think about him every day. And I've been particularly thinking about him in this time and the lessons that I learned from him. My father was born in 1927. He was born in Arkansas at the height of Jim Crow. Everything about his growing up years and that crushing experience shaped his worldview. He was a man who loved his family and was proud of his children. But everything about his worldview, his aspirations, was shaped by the terrible, crushing racism that he faced his whole life. My father was also a deaf man. He lost his hearing when he was in his early 20s. And that was also another blow to him struggling to find dignity and acceptance in a hearing world. What I worry about in this time and thinking about my experience growing up and watching my father struggle is that the pillars of our democracy, I really do believe, are under siege. They're clearly under siege by a president who doesn't respect the rule of law, who does a lot to foment racism and division. But they're also under siege in this moment, I believe, where we are not building bridges to each other, where we are vilifying people who have a difference of opinion on one issue or another. I'm very concerned about that. And it's not just the right, it's also the left and the center. We will not be able to move forward and tackle these very difficult issues, which are, we all know the list, if we don't find a way to talk to each other with civility and respect. This is a problem that's been brewing for some years now. I think in part it contributed to the election of Donald Trump. And I do think it's been exacerbated in the last 4 years. And I think the challenge for us, people of goodwill, is how do we take this moment and use it as an opportunity to bring people closer together? There are a lot of hard truths that we must face. You know, Reverend Otis Moss of Trinity, I think, said it best. We are not just dealing with the pandemic of COVID-19, but we are dealing with the lasting effects of the original sin of COVID-19. That's all true. But what do? How do we talk to each other? How do we have conversation that results in solutions and that actually moves us forward? Now, I know we're here ostensibly to talk about police reform and accountability, and there's many things to be said about that issue. But fundamentally, the framing for that topic, but every other topic in this time, really depends on our ability to speak to each other and come together around a common set of solutions. Our democracy is built on a notion of debate, vigorous debate, of participation and engagement, but ultimately around compromise. And for far too long, the notion of compromise has become a dirty word. We can't move forward in standoffs. We can't move forward with people retreating to their corners and lobbing bombs, literal and figurative, at each other. That is not the way that our democracy will survive. It's certainly not a way that we can thrive as a city, as a state, and a nation. And what I hope comes from this moment is the power to reflect, the power to think about and face hard truths, absolutely. But I hope what it does is, as the adults in the conversation, that we model the behavior that we want our young people to emulate and follow and to move us forward in the next generation. I worry a lot about our young people growing up in the age of social media, in the age of devices and disconnection. I worry a lot about how we are allowing discourse to be shaped. I don't want my daughter, my precious 12-year-old, to think that the way that she quote unquote wins is by destroying and vilifying anybody who stands in her way. I worry a lot about that. And I think in this moment, where so many cross currents are blowing, I think we've got to separate out the noise and figure out a way, a path forward for civil discussion and debate that leads to solutions. Look, I'm a lawyer, I'm an advocate, and I love being an advocate. But I also know that being an effective advocate is about persuading others that you've got the better of the argument. Persuasion isn't a tax. Persuasion isn't vilifying. Persuasion is about convincing and coaxing people that you're right, that you've got the better facts, that you've got the better morals standing, that you've got the better legal argument. That's what our democracy is founded on. And I worry a lot that we are straying from that basic tenet that makes us different than other places. We do value vigorous debate. We do value and safeguard the precious First Amendment rights of speech and assembly. But we've got to do it in a way that adds to the debate. And dear God, we've got to do it in a way that doesn't endanger the public safety of others, of people who assemble for peaceful debate, and our police officers who are there to serve and protect. This hasn't been a perfect moment, none are, but I hope that we can pull the strands of a conversation and mold it into something that we can use to move forward, to advance the issues that we all hold dear, and do it in a way that brings people together. I learned through my work in police accountability and reform that we have to bring people on the journey with us from the first step, not later on when the race has been run. I hope that in this moment, we find a way to link arms and walk forward together, because that's the only way that we're going to heal the wounds that are there, the trauma that so many of our people are experiencing. We've got to use this moment for good.
Thank you, Mayor. That is what we're hoping to do this morning, to have deep, real talk that is additive and solution-oriented. I want to turn to the Honorable Attorney General Kwame Raoul to speak to us briefly.
Thank you, and I'll try to be as brief as possible. First off, I want to thank both Senator Durbin and Mayor Lightfoot for their leadership on this issue. Senator Durbin's office and my office has been in touch on making sure that language that I and my 17 of my Attorney General colleagues have asked to be included in the George Floyd bill. And they made sure that that language was included, and that would be language to give us a state AG's pattern and practice investigation authority, as was given to the Department of Justice in the 1994 crime bill. And it's interesting that that provision in the 1994 crime bill came on the heels of the Rodney King beating. I want to thank the mayor for her leadership, both as mayor, but prior to becoming mayor on this issue. I had the opportunity to serve on a subcommittee of the task force. And so I think we're in a unique position having the mayor in the office that she is right now because of her experience prior to her coming into the office. And I look forward to working together going forward. It's interesting, and I want to thank you all for hosting this discussion. It's interesting that we often have these discussions on the heels of an incident, of an isolated incident, whether it's George Floyd, Laquan McDonald, Michael Brown. And oftentimes, as a result of that, there starts to be a discussion and approach about, well, yeah, that incident was bad, but that's just a bad apple within the department, instead of a comprehensive discussion on what allows systemically bad apples to be in the position to commit the acts that they commit. Shortly after I was sworn in as Attorney General, within a week, I was faced with an issue as to whether or not to petition our Supreme Court with regards to the sentencing of Jason Van Dyke, which I believe then, and I continue to believe now, was an illegal sentencing that didn't fully hold him accountable, but most importantly, didn't follow direct Supreme Court precedent, direct on-point Supreme Court precedent. Unfortunately, the Supreme Court did not hear substantive arguments on the issue. During the time that I was challenging that sentencing, I noted numerous reports on that opined that, you know, we've already dealt with the situation. He's been sentenced. Why don't we just let it go? Why don't we just abandon it? And it's that bad apple philosophy or bad apple approach that doesn't allow us to take the comprehensive approach that I'm hopeful that we will take now. I think this is a unique time. I think the George Floyd incident has spurred people into the type of action and the type of discussions that from all sorts of places that previously did not pay attention, notwithstanding previous incidents, did not pay attention to this discussion. We're talking about racial equity in other spheres that don't have to do with law enforcement reform. So I'm hopeful that this time is different. I certainly commit my effort and my office's effort to move us forward in this discussion, not only in the city of Chicago, but throughout the state of Illinois and collectively with my colleagues throughout the country.
Thank you so much. I want to turn to Brendan Shiller, who's on the panel as well. Brendan, you are managing partner at SPJS Law. You're also a founder and board president of the Westside Justice Center. Can you parse out the difference for us? We hear a lot of terms in this conversation around police accountability. We hear conversation around police reform, around defund, around abolition. Can you parse the difference out for us? Yes.
Okay. I'm a lawyer. I represent a lot of the activists. I worked on the consent decree from the Campbell plaintiff's perspective 3 years ago, where we proposed the People's Consent Decree that included a lot of provisions that animated the concepts of defund and abolition, some of which actually were included in the ultimate consent decree, some of them weren't. But I like to think about more from the perspective of somebody who's been managing a law firm, a small law firm for 17 years. And when you manage a law firm or you manage any small business, you have to put the people who know what they're doing in the right place to do it, and the people who have the skills, and you have to do what's most cost effective. We know that in general, 911, 89% of the calls that they receive are for things that don't involve crime or violence. They're things like mental health, suicide, traffic issues. And that if you were to actually put people who have, in the case of mental health and suicide and drug addiction, who have the skills and expertise to address those issues, if you were to reroute those calls, for instance, to DFSS, which is what the Campbell plaintiffs proposed 3 years ago, prior to either Mayor Lightfoot being mayor or AG Raoul being the Attorney General, that you could not only have a more effective response because you have experts addressing it, it's more affordable because they're actually in many ways cheaper, and you take that 89% off of the obligations of the 911 callers in the police department, and you have less community violence. What we've learned, and less police violence, what we've learned is the primary way to avoid police violence in the consent decrees that have occurred in the last 20 years that have been effective is less interaction. You don't have the interaction that heightens tension because police officers are unprepared. But then even the remaining 11% half of that in this state are the Class B and Class C misdemeanors that are nonviolent things that are similar to the George Floyd $20 or the Eric Gardner cigarette. And if you even take those off, as we proposed with the Campbell plaintiffs, and you take those 60,000 Class B and Class C misdemeanor arrests that never result in prison time and turn them into something that is ticketable or summonsable, and you create an innovative technological process to deal with traffic and other issues where you need to create a record just for insurance, what you now have is a situation where you've taken 95% of the 911 calls off of the table. You've taken 2/3 of the misdemeanor arrests, 60,000 arrests off of the table. And you now have freed up all sorts of resources that you can then put into the community in the form of mental health, education, things that we know reduce crime, such as youth jobs, teenage jobs, youth recreation. And now that remaining 5.5%, you actually reduce that even further because you fought the violence at the root. And so when you talk about the fund, what we're saying is be efficient, be innovative, attack problems at the root, use your budget priorities to identify where those problems are first in what the officers do. And then when you free up the money in terms of attacking the root, in terms of funding the issues that actually prevent violence. And then ultimately what you end up with is a much smaller system than what you have now. And when you're at that point and you've spent years, if not decades, addressing the trauma in the community, maybe you can envision something else because you're now much smaller. And you have the ability to be much more innovative with technology. And that may lead to some type of abolition. I'm not here to speak on behalf of the activists. I can't talk for them. But I can tell you as a parent, I spent, and the other panelists on here are parents, I spent 99.9% of my resources, energy, and love nurturing, housing, feeding my children, and 0.1% disciplining them. And if I had a child that was named Southside and a child that was named Northside, and I spent 99.9% of my time, energy, and resources housing, educating, nurturing Northside, and less than 50% of my resources housing, educating Southside, and spent half of my time disciplining them, they would end up unloved and rightfully angry. And I think that's where we're at in the city.
I want to welcome Reverend Ciera Chamberlain to the panel. Ciera is the executive director of Live Free Chicago and has done a tremendous amount of work and organizing around anti-gun violence in the city and in the south suburbs in particular. Reverend, often when we talk about changes in policing, the argument is about gun violence. And so we are admittedly in a city that has an issue with gun violence. And we have all hurt seeing in particular children who have been harmed. So in terms of the argument that more police can help stem gun violence, others then point to 12,000 police officers, 40% of the operating budget, and a continuing problem with gun violence. How do you talk to us about the issue of gun violence in the city of Chicago and whether it does or does not intersect with the conversation around police accountability?
When we're looking at gun violence, of course, it's always a call for more police. But if we just look through our history and if we can be students of history to see that there's been not only just in Chicago, but there's a culture of policing that says that the police system does not work for Black people. If we look at the Commission on Race and Relations in 1922, when the riots were taking place, the needs that the commission produced was that there is a need for housing, employment, schools, and to improve the race relations between the police and community. When we looked at the Kerner Commissioner report, it said the same thing. When there was a task force that was created when Laquan McDonald was murdered, it was the same thing. So at some point, we have to be students of history and realize that there has to be a bold move that says that policing does not reduce violence, it does not prevent violence. And in fact, if I'm not an expert in economics, or in profit and loss in organizations, but it says that the clearance rate was 5% in 2016 for shootings. And if there's an entity or an institution that is performing at those low rates, they will not continue to be funded at the substantial amount that they are. So when we're looking at gun violence, there has to be an investment in public health, and those are proven strategies that we know that have worked across the country. So we have to follow, if we're following suit with New York and LA, who have drastically seen the reductions in their homicides, we have to begin to follow suit and realize this is not a policing issue. This is a public health issue. And so instead of seeing the police chief anytime there's a shooting, we need to be relying on the public health department and the community and figuring out how do we actually use the public health approach and not use it as talking points, but how are we dealing with our communities who have been traumatized from racism and neglect for centuries? How are we using this approach, a trauma-informed approach, to invest in our communities so that we can actually reduce violence?
Thank you. Senator Durbin, I know that you have to run, and I want to send a question your way while you're still with us. The president is sending federal troops into Chicago, and I wondered what your thoughts are on this, and also what can be done on the ground to keep us from experiencing another Portland or feeling like our country is sending a private army in.
Well, let me say I'm glad I'm on the panel with Mayor Lightfoot. She's been a leader in articulating our position on this. And she and I are both hopeful that what we have been promised by people we respect in the federal government is going to be lived up to. But we're both watching very carefully to make sure whatever happens in Chicago does not deteriorate into the horrible, unconstitutional situation that we've seen prevail in Portland, Oregon. In that situation, and I've joined with Jeff Merkley and Ron Wyden in legislation to make sure this does not happen again. In that situation, we had federal officials, law enforcement officials, with specific responsibility. For example, the Federal Protective Service has a responsibility to protect federal buildings, reach beyond their jurisdiction and move into the community without the coordination of local law enforcement. And I spoke to the mayor and to the governor on Monday of this week, and we expressed our alarm that the continuing rhetoric from the White House, from the president in particular, suggested that we were next on the list with Albuquerque and Kansas City. And a number of us reached out directly to people in the administration, including the mayor, to get a definition of exactly what was going to happen, if anything. What we have been told is something called Project Legend, which began in July of this year in Kansas City with the killing of a 4-year-old young boy, and is now an effort to try to reduce crime and violence and to stop drug trafficking. We've been told 150 federal, at least the latest I've heard, 150 federal people will be allocated to this undertaking in coordination with the state and local law enforcement authorities. But I will tell you, what happened in Portland, I believe, was a campaign stunt by this president to show that he was tough on crime and tough on dominating neighborhoods and cities as he has promised. Yes, we can use help from the administration in dealing with gun violence. Senator Duckworth and I sent a letter 3 years ago that was never responded to, that went through the particulars of what we needed by way of resources and personnel. No response whatsoever from the administration. So I would like to, if you don't mind, Angelique, hand it off to the mayor. She probably has the more timely information on this and has been a real leader and partner in this effort.
Thank you, Senator, and I will respond. And I want to be very, very clear. There are no federal troops coming to Chicago. That is very, very important that people understand. We have been assured from the highest levels that what we are getting is additional resources to supplement federal agents that are already here, FBI, DEA, ATF. Now we need to better understand the DHS resources that are coming. That is one that I know all of us, the Senator, myself, the Attorney General, we have concerns about that. I will be in a briefing later today, and believe me, I will ask very pointed questions about what that means. But I think we have to be very careful in our language because troops sounds ominous, and troops is concerning. Even in Portland, as bad as that is, and then I've now been in contact with my good friend Jenny Durkin, who's the mayor of Seattle. There are assets being deployed there. Even those are not troops. They are related to Customs and Border Patrol. They are related to DHS and Federal Protective Services. But again, that's a far cry different than troops. The only time I've seen troops deployed in recent memory is the foolishness that was done in Washington, D.C. by the president. That decision was quickly and rightfully denounced by people across the political aisles, and rightfully so, and those troops were quickly withdrawn. That's not what we're facing here in Chicago, as I understand it, based on a lot of conversations with folks at the White House, as well as the U.S. Attorney here. And I think the other important thing that folks should realize that's different in Chicago than in Portland is that the U.S. Attorney here actually has been read into the plan and is responsible for these additional resources that are coming to Chicago. And he will be at the helm. John Lausch, who's the U.S. Attorney, many of us know him. He's a former colleague and a 20-year friend. I have great confidence in his abilities. He lives in the city, and I know he understands why we can't have, unmarked, unknown, secret federal agents on our streets acting like the police and violating people's constitutional rights. I don't expect that to happen, but as the senator said, we will remain diligent, and we are ready to take decisive action in concert with the Attorney General, Raoul, in the event that any line is crossed. We won't hesitate to use every tool at our disposal to shut that down and shut it down quickly.
Thank you, Mayor. And I want to come back to you in a second to talk more about language and points of confusion, but I wanted to give Brendan a chance to respond to this conversation.
Appreciate the way, thank you, Angelique. And I really appreciate the way that Mayor Lightfoot initially framed this about being open and finding solutions. And so I'm open to not using the term troopers, stormtroopers, if she's open to hearing the concern that from our perspective, that what she's suggesting is really in some ways a distinction without substantive difference. What we know in this city is that there's a 20-year history in some of the most egregious conduct by CPD, also involving federal agents. When you talk about SOS and what they did in the early 2000s, that was often done in coordination with the HITA task force. When you talk about the Area 5 gun team that did 1,500 bad warrants between 2007 and 2014, that was often done in conjunction with the HITA task force. When you talk about disappearing people at Home and Square, that was often done in conjunction with DEA agents and ATF agents. When you talk about the federal game house stash program that former Chief Judge Castillo, Presiding Judge Castillo, called racist to its core, that was done often with CPD folks. And I know that the mayor has a different experience. She has a different experience in terms of her relationships. But bringing in more resources with federal folks, even if they're not troopers, with those people that are not held accountable by the current structures in the city, such as the consent decree and COPA, creates the opportunity for more police violence and therefore more community violence in the city. So I will take her challenge and refrain from calling them stormtroopers, but their presence still can create greater issues in the community. And I would ask her to take her own challenge and to consider that perspective.
So Angelique, I don't want this to be a debate, and I've listened respectfully to now the twice that Brennan has spoken. And while I think that some of the things that you've said are just factually and demonstrably inaccurate, I don't want to get into a back and forth with you. That's not what this, I think, at least it wasn't what it was posed to me as being. But there is a fundamental difference. As you well know, federal agents have been stationed in Chicago for decades. Additional agents coming to aid in the crime fight, which we do need their help. We do need the federal sentences and jurisdiction to help keep our community safe. It's obviously a tool, not the only tool, and we can disagree on that. But I think your characterization of what this is just not accurate and candidly not particularly helpful. I'm happy to have more of a discussion offline, but I think the thing that we need to be doing is not fomenting more fear and concern amongst our residents. That doesn't help anybody. Yeah, obviously there's got to be transparency. Obviously, we need to make sure that people understand exactly what is going on, but hyperbole, overblown rhetoric doesn't really help in that regard. And you know, the question of, am I open? Sir, you obviously don't know my history. Of course I'm open. I have been on the front lines of listening in really difficult circumstances because I think it's critically important that people are heard. And I have been in lots of different circumstances that are tough, that are hostile, but I'm there and I'm always going to be there because that's the right thing to do. That's what leaders do. We get into the community, we listen to a range of different voices, and we make sure that the lived experience of our residents is reflected in our actions and our policy and how we build coalitions and solutions.
I'm going to jump in because I want to go back to the comment that you started with, Mayor, about how do we have very deep, real talk across difference? How do we make sure that it's additive? How do we make sure it's solution oriented? This is a really tough conversation to frame. It took me many rewrites to even think about how to frame this conversation today because there's so much emotion, rightfully so, and trauma around this discussion. But I believe that we can do it. And what Brendan mentioned is about, that I want to stay on with you, Mayor, is really more about the accountability piece of the police department. What are the pieces from the consent decree to the FOP contract that helps give the feeling that accountability is in place? So let's talk about the FOP contract, and AG Raoul, I'm going to turn to you in a little bit to talk about the consent decree. Often people see the FOP contract, and you have had your own interaction with the FOP that's been documented on Twitter and in other places. But I think that there's a feeling that within the contract, this is a space where unaccountability is legalized. Some of the reforms that were suggested from the task force report to the consent decree around the FOP contract seem pretty reasonable. And in other spaces, in other professions, you wouldn't be given time to corroborate a false report. You would be, put into a database if you had misconduct, and you wouldn't be able to go and get a job in a different jurisdiction. You wouldn't need an affidavit to move forward with a complaint. What is your office, what is the play for your office? What is the responsibility and the move so that we can create a different contract, potentially to create more trust with community?
So let me just give context to where we are in this discussion. I think it's 3 weeks ago today, we were able to finally publicly announce historic changes in the contracts for our supervisors, the sergeants, lieutenants, and captains. Historic in this regard. You mentioned a number of points that now are embedded in the contract. Previously, if there was an anonymous complaint, that couldn't be that couldn't be investigated. It is now. Previously, the levels of, the Byzantine levels of the disciplinary system were so difficult and opaque, it took years, if ever, to hold police accountable. We've changed that in the contract. So we will use that as a template for our fight, and it will be a fight with the FOP. The FOP contract has unfortunately been expired for some years now. We walked into that as a reality. We are finally back at the table with the FOP, and we intend to forge even more reforms as part of the contracts. I've said this before, and I believe it to be true. These contracts are not merely transactional. They have to be a place where we speak our values. And police reform and accountability has to be reflected in those contracts. We won great gains with the sergeants, lieutenants, and captains contract. The FOP knows that we're going to push for those and more in their contract. And that's why I say it's going to be a fight. But we can't continue to think that these contracts are irrelevant to the question of reform and accountability. They are not. And we intend to press the case in the FOP, and I feel confident that we will make significant progress. Now, I want to be clear, you know, I'm not a labor lawyer, but I know enough about it to be dangerous. For way too long, we haven't tried to press for reform in these contracts. That sets a precedent. And this will go to arbitration, and the arbitrator will be looking at that to say, well, look, city, for 20 years, you've never spoken on this issue, that issue, or the other issue. You've set a precedent. But we feel confident that given the win that we got with an arbitrator in the PPBA contract, that we're going to be able to make the case in arbitration against the FOP that these changes are vital and essential. We have to have them lined up with the accountability measures that are in the consent decree. And right now the contracts are not. And we can't have those out of line. And I think you know this, but it bears repeating, and I'm sure the Attorney General will get into this. The consent decrees cannot void existing contracts. They have strong recommendations on what the path forward is and a roadmap, but there's no court that I'm aware of that has mandated change in police contracts, even in the face of a consent decree where those provisions are in conflict. That's why it's so critically important for us to push hard to get those contracts aligned with the reform agenda that we have for the police department in order for us to be able to move forward. And we intend to do just that.
Thank you. I want to acknowledge Senator Durbin, who stayed with us for so long and has to run. I don't know if there's anything you want to say before you go.
No, just to tell you that I think we all sense that we're at a moment in history when there's a potential to make a real change in America for good. And that 8 minutes and 46 seconds has had a profound impact on us. I just hope all of us who are lucky enough to be in elective office and those who are supporting us will stand behind us as we try to make some significant changes. As I said, it's going to start at the top. It's going to take new leadership in the White House to make it happen, but I believe it can. So I'm going to continue to work with Kwame, with the mayor, with the governor, and my colleague, Senator Duckworth, to do everything. Thanks again to CABRINI Green for all that you've done. Glad to be with you today.
Thank you, Senator. AG Raoul, I want to turn to you. I'm sure that there are some pieces of the FOP contract that you wanted to touch on, but I also wanted to ask you about the consent decree itself. The federal consent decree was put into place following a lawsuit from your predecessor, Lisa Madigan, who sued the city to enact the reforms following the 2017 DOJ report that found CPD had a history of civil rights violations and pattern and practice of excessive force and abuse. And a June 2020 report shows that CPD missed 70% of the deadlines in the first year. what can the AG's office do to hold CPD accountable? And if this is the big accountability play in the reform playbook, why isn't it working?
Well, listen, first of all, before I touch on this, I wanted to touch on a prior question because there was a little bit of a debate, and I want to echo some of the sentiments communicated by the mayor and the senator. We've all been in touch. I've been in touch with John Lausch. I've been in touch with leaders of federal law enforcement agencies, and it's important to understand that my office has, as well as CPD and state police and sheriff's office, has historically worked in partnership with these federal law enforcement agencies on a wide variety of issues: drug trafficking, internet predators, violent crime, and most recently, COVID-related crimes. And so that's an ongoing relationship. At the same time, I have an anxiety about what happened in Portland and what's coming out of the president's mouth. So we can be prepared for both. We can be prepared to react to unconstitutional actions that may come from federal protection services, as well as continue to collaborate legitimately with law enforcement, as we have, from federal law enforcement, as we have historically have done. With shifting to the consent decree, yes, certainly we raised last month a concern with regards to deadlines that have been missed. The mayor and I have had conversations prior to that, and we both acknowledge a need to move that forward. At the beginning, at the outset of the implementation of the consent decree, the most critical 3 words I thought that was in the judge's order was, let us begin. And there was so much that's packed into those 3 words. And I think part of that is that this is going to be a process that takes as long as it needs to take to have the comprehensive reform of a department that over decades has led to the systemic problems, not the isolated bad apple problems that I spoke about in my opening, but systemic problems that need undoing. When people embrace nomenclature like defund or abolish, I believe it's done because we cannot fix the long existing problems by tinkering. There has to be comprehensive change, which the consent decree in part talks about with regards to this de-escalation and accountability, getting better supervisor to officer ratios, collection of data, pointing on when a gun is pointed. You know, it's interesting. I responded to a social media post recently that asked the question, how old were you the first time a police officer pointed a gun at you? My answer was 17. There were answers that were 6, 8, 9, 10. And so we have to acknowledge from that there are systemic problems that exist. Over the course of my 1.5 years in the Attorney General's office, there have been, I've worked with, communicated with 3 different superintendents. I've recently met one-on-one with Superintendent Brown. He's at the sort of beginning of his tenure, and there's been some changes in leadership at the Chicago Police Department. Those are some of the things that are necessary to really effect change. There is, I don't think the mayor would disagree with me. Not to put words in her mouth, but I think there probably have been individuals historically within the police department that are resistant to some of the changes that are implicated in the consent decree. That makes it difficult for us to move forward. And so personnel changes in leadership are important to moving this forward. We are not the sole plaintiff in the consent decree, so we have continued communication with the other two groups, two coalitions, and we know we have at our disposal the ability to go to Judge Dow and motion up a case if we don't see adequate progress. There is a monitor, Maggie Hickey, and she has acknowledged some of the challenges of moving in a rapid and enough pace, but I'm hopeful that we can do so. Now, and finally, before I shut up and mute myself, the consent decree includes a best efforts clause, and it recognizes that there has to be efforts not only in the negotiation of collective bargaining agreements. I once did serve as a labor lawyer negotiating contracts with 13 different collective bargaining units. And so, yes, provisions making certain that complaints that are anonymous will be investigated. Provisions that make certain that there is another deterrent to people coming forth with complaints. But that also has to be addressed legislatively. There are some legislative restrictions, including that complaints need to be accompanied by a signed affidavit, and that if there's a false statement within such an affidavit, it's mandated to be reported for prosecution by the local state's attorney. That is a deterrent to anybody coming forth with a complaint, and we have to address things legislatively. On the accountability front, I've started back a conversation that I started when I was in the legislature 5-6 years ago, and I'll correct that. Former Senator Tim Bivens started the conversation around police licensing. I've been in contact with law enforcement leaders, including Superintendent Brown, as well as the Chiefs of Police Association, the Sheriff's Association, the Law Enforcement Training and Standards Board, about the notion of police licensing outside of the local departmental disciplinary process, just as we have as lawyers, as doctors, as hairdressers, as in all sorts of professions. We have an accountability scheme that if you engage in conduct unbecoming of being in that profession, you can be held accountable at the state level, and we're hopeful about moving that forward legislatively.
Thank you. We have 6 people on our panel. We had 60 minutes to talk. We are talking about the most pressing issues of our time around police accountability, and we are discussing them passionately and honestly. And I want to thank everybody for joining to do that. To close our panel, I wanted to refer back to the original framing around what will the history books say about Chicago during this time, and ask each of our panelists to take a minute just to be futurists. And I want to start with Reverend Chamberlain, first of all, because we did not have as much time to talk with you, to see if there's anything else you wanted to say, and then ask that you move into your prediction of what the history books will say.
Thank you. So 2 things that I want to say before I look to the future. There's a huge piece that we really have to address, just the culture and policing. And a solution to that could be the city just starting out and saying that there's a zero tolerance policy for racist police. And there are ways that we can do that I'm happy to discuss later on, but there are ways that we can say there's a zero tolerance police and mean it. Zero tolerance for racist police and really mean it and say it. The second piece is that, again, there has to be money invested into a public health approach, millions of dollars, and that's when we say defund the police. That means invest into strategies that work. We can't continue to talk about, policing tactics, when we need to hear more from the public health department and the public health approach, investing into the mental health of our people, because Black people are dying. 80% of the people are dying are Black people. And looking into the future, I would like to see tangible changes, meaning that when we go through our communities, when we visit our family members, when we're sitting on our porches, that Black people are able to live free from violence, from being incarcerated, that we're able to live, to have that Black dignity that we all preach about, but we can tangibly see it.
Thank you, Reverend. I'm going to turn to Brendan next.
Thank you, Angelique. I think history is still being written right now. We don't know what history is going to say. And funny enough, I think what history says about Chicago has a lot more to do with what happens in Springfield than what happens in Chicago. The mayor was right. Consent decrees can't impact CBAs. But CBAs, as the Supreme Court ruled on June 18th, thanks to good litigation by the city, can't abrogate what state law says. And when you talk about the accountability issues that AG Raoul raised, that's the Police Officer Bill of Rights. When you talk about the barriers to holding officers civilly liable, that's not only qualified immunity, but that's the Tort Immunity Act. When you talk about the distinction between what use force officers can use and what private citizens can use, that's what's called the objective reasonable standard, but it's actually very subjective as it relates to police use of violence. And when you talk about the various ways that we can really begin to fund our communities and reduce the culture of policing through greater accountability and criminal justice reform, that's going to either happen in Springfield in the fall or not. And I think that, honestly, I think what's going to happen in Springfield in the fall will dictate in many ways how we're viewed in the city of Chicago. I believe, and I suspect one or two of the panelists disagree, I believe that the community activists and the youth activists and the youth leaders who have moved this discussion into various possibilities and realms and visions that hadn't been in the public discussion before have done a great job. And I know that they're going to continue to do the job. And frankly, those are my leaders. Those young activists who have envisioned for the last 7, 8 years new ways to do public safety and have brought that to the street, whether it be civilly or uncivilly, those are the folks who I'm impressed by and who I'm following. And either way, regardless of whether we get something substantive done in Springfield in the fall, I am proud of my city right now and couldn't be any prouder.
Thank you, Brendan. Let's turn to AG Raoul.
Brendan, I'm not going to disagree with you. I'm inspired by the activism of my stepson, my daughter, and their friends, and I have had a number of recent conversations with my colleague in Minnesota, AG Keith Ellison, whose son is on the Minnesota City Council, which voted for a defund initiative to recreate the public safety in Minnesota. Whether or not I embrace every definition of defund or abolish, I think it has inspired conversations that I've tried to have historically by introducing things such as the Stefan Watts Act that call for a mental health response when there's a mental health call. So I think we are aligned in a lot of the conversations associated with the nomenclature of defund or abolish, whether or not I fully embrace the notion of abolishing a police department. What I'm hopeful history will say is that because of the lack of tolerance and acceptance from institutional players that have historically turned a blind eye to what has happened with law enforcement, that this was in fact a pivotal time. We've seen during COVID-19, during the stay-at-home orders from a period from March 22nd to April 23rd, there were 72% fewer arrests than that same period a year ago, which suggests to us that we can embrace diversion tactics and and we can start looking at in Springfield at what offenses might be eligible for a reduction in their classification, because we've had a history in Springfield of enhancing penalties, not based on science or data, but just to be tough on crime. And so we have to relieve some of the burden on police officers. And one of the critical things that I want to say is, as I close, I think this conversation sometimes is framed as an anti-law enforcement conversation, and it is not. My focus on accountability, one of the major pieces of my focus on accountability is focused on this licensing proposal, and it has been primarily conversation with law enforcement leaders that embrace the notion, because they have had trouble holding bad cops accountable historically. I've had conversation with labor leaders because I understand that the proposal will be characterized as an attack on collective bargaining, and those conversations have been good. They understand that I'm not coming towards trying to undermine collective bargaining in general, but we want accountability for bad police officers that ought not be able to be police officers in any department in the state of Illinois, that they may be fired or that they may quit under investigation and hop to another police department. We should have no longer have a tolerance for that and have a mechanism to prevent that from happening.
Thank you, AG Raoul. Mayor Lightfoot?
So your question was, what will history say of this moment and of us? I'll end where I started, which is that I hope we use this opportunity to reinforce the pillars of our democracy that have really been shaken in recent years, and particularly in recent months. And I hope that individually, we will work on building bridges over which others can travel to us and over which we can travel to them.
I want to thank all of our panelists today for joining us in this moment where having a conversation across difference is the only way that we're going to find solutions to move forward. I also want to thank the Illinois Justice Project for the work that they do all the time, as well as the Cabrini Green Legal Aid organization. We are going to take a short break, and then we will start up again at 11:15 for the Courts and Incarceration panel that will run from 11:15 to 12:30. Thanks, everybody. See you again at 11:15.